Welcome to On the Bauble podcast, episode 33. I'm your host, Sabasa J. Ueda, and with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today, we're going to be talking about how to draft Ranger, so Azalea and Riptide for the Outsiders draft format. But before we go into that, how was your week, Yuki?
My week's been pretty good. Just been drafting a lot, playing a lot of Constructed, having to take a little bit of a break since, or not a break, but just like playing slightly less since report cards are coming up for me on Friday. So in a few days here as of recording. But yeah, other than that, pretty good. Really excited for Pro Tour, feeling in pretty good spot overall, actually. Maybe the most comfortable I've been leading up to a Pro Tour, which is exciting.
When is the Pro Tour? Is it next weekend?
It's so we're recording on Tuesday the 18th. It's 2 weekends from now, I guess, starting on Friday the 28th.
Oh, okay, so it's real close.
Yeah, it's like a week and a half away, so it's right around the corner, and yeah, excited.
Do you have any secret tech for Classic Constructed you can talk about on the pod?
I mean, I think I'm pretty much locked on Lexi at this point. I think that my take right now is that either Lexi or Oldhim are probably the best things to be doing in the format, although I think you could make a case for Azalea or Dromai as well, and maybe a couple other picks. Like I think like maybe Briar's fine. Maybe if somebody can find the right Azuri list, maybe it has potential. I'm not sure. That list kind of feels not figured out yet. But yeah, it's nothing too groundbreaking. Honestly, I don't think the deck is that far from what I have, what I played at Chicago, and then just maybe a few tweaks here and there to target the matchups we're expecting, but nothing too crazy. It's mostly the same stuff.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, let's just move right into the main topic today because it might be a long one. So, talking about the Rangers in this Outsiders draft, let's start off with, where do you want to start off with?
I think we can kind of start off with like some of the stuff that the Rangers share, which is not a lot, honestly. I actually think Azalea and Riptide, they kind of want a lot of the same cards, but they also want a lot of different cards. Like it's like there's overlap, but I think that they're like maybe in some ways more distinct than some of the other classes. And so we'll kind of talk about like the high priority picks in both of them, and then I think how they differ from each other. So first off, let's talk about blues. How do you feel about blues and Ranger?
I feel like blues, I think other than 3 blocks, I'm going to be avoiding all blues at this point. The typical turn in Ranger, unless you are playing Fletch with Redtail, ends up being a load or flip over a arrow and then shoot it. So you actually only need 2 resources. So as long as you have a yellow in your hand, that's almost all the resources you would ever need to play your turn. And obviously some versions of Ranger I think needs blues that like maybe play that Peace of Minds or just like more ways to use their resources. But I think right now typically if I just want to fire an arrow, it's gonna be 2 resources, so just a yellow card is fine for my resource cards. But because of that, people don't like yellows. You get like a bunch of yellows in your deck and a bunch of reds in your deck, which I feel like is just like higher power level overall and just better in this format.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. And I like what you said about the big exception being with Fletch, or alternatively also Come to Fight is another 1 cost that will push your cost up to 3. And I think if you are drafting Ranger and you are playing these cards, especially if you have multiple, like red Come to Fight in particular, unless you're just planning to block with it, you probably want not a ton of blues, but a few, like maybe like 5 to 6 range kind of thing, so that you can play these 1 costs sometimes. But yeah, if you have all 0 cost bumps, I think my ideal version of Ranger would probably have pretty much all yellow pitches for resources, and then you just kind of have more I don't know, you have higher card quality in your deck, I guess. The main blues I'm happy to see are probably like, I think Blue Toxicity and Blue Fletch are decent, and the blue The blue Withering Shot and blue Infecting Shots I'm pretty fond of, just because if you put an aim counter on them or you pump them up, they can start hitting breakpoints and they still block 3, like you said. But other than that, like I don't really want blues in my deck.
Yeah, just like the very generic non on hit arrows at blue is like quite mediocre. Like they're looking more like a titanium bubble than anything, honestly.
Yeah, yeah, and honestly, kind of worse than that when you're playing against Assassin, which I do think is one of the which can be a hard matchup for Ranger, I think, just because the Spider's Bites can debuff them and then they don't even always block 3. So
Yeah, that's so true. It's those cards can become a very big liability very quickly. You just rather have traps where it doesn't get debuffed by Spider's Bite. And I think like the more traps you have, the better against Assassin exactly.
I guess Blue Come to Fight is also fine in Riptide, just basically purely as a blocking card that you can also pitch. But
Yeah, I like Come to Fight in every color. It's just like
yeah, it's
in
just good
almost
in
every
every
deck.
deck.
Yeah.
Except for Azalea, I guess. But anyways, we'll get to that.
Okay, let's talk about the Assassin Ranger hybrid cards first. Well, what card do you like from the Assassin Ranger cards?
I think if we're talking about both heroes, it's pretty much just red Death Touch, maybe yellow. I think that Azalea really wants. We'll talk about exactly what the deck looks like, but I think you really want your arrows and your pumps and your maybe like some rabbles, and that's kind of what you want in your deck. And cards like Death Touch, while they are very good, don't especially fit with the game plan. Having like the red one is probably still good enough. You can kind of like block out and come in with a Death Touch to get some tempo back and hopefully have a good turn. But I think in general, the Assassin Ranger cards are much better in Riptide than they are in Azalea.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think one exception would be I think you forgot about the traps. Frailty Trap, Inertia Trap, and Blood Rod Trap. I think that those three are pretty good in both classes.
I don't like having those cards in my Azalea deck.
Oh, you don't? Okay, okay. Let's talk about this real quick. Okay, so I think myself, I'm almost never gonna draft a Azalea train at this point, and I think Yuki is on the other, almost the other side, where I think you like Azalea better than Riptide. Is that right?
I don't know if I like it better than Riptide. I think Riptide might actually be the stronger deck when it comes together, but I think that Riptide needs lots of cards and some decent card quality for me to want to play the deck. And so I like to give myself outs to draft Azalea instead if I'm because sometimes you're kind of short on playables and it feels really bad.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we're gonna talk about this more later, but Riptide requires a lot of just cardboard in the deck. Like you want
Yeah.
more than 35 cards in your deck, and because of 14 card pack, it's very difficult to have an equipment and cards in deck. And I guess that's what Yuki doesn't like.
Yeah. To me, I feel like you can have like Azalea's like she needs particular cards, but she's also like kind of surprisingly scrappy. Like I think she can do a lot with a little. I've had some decks that don't look particularly great and play pretty well, and kind of give you an idea of what that looks like when we get to Azalea. Um, yeah. Do you want to continue on with the generics and the kind of premium cards in the decks?
Yep, that sounds great. So let's talk about the generics first. I think it's pretty obvious what generics are good in this decks. So Ravenous Rabble Red. I'm just gonna go through the whole list. Actually, it's gonna be Ravenous Rabble Red, Scout the Periphery Red, and Seek Horizon Red. And all three of them is basically red generics with Go again.
Yeah, and I think Seek Horizon Red is notable. Would you say notably worse? For me, it's notably worse. I don't love this card. I just feel like when you're giving it 4 go again for 2 cards, it's like you can do it and it's fine, but it's not great. Even Azalea, when you can like dominate the arrow, it's just the rate on it is not great. Like you can play this card, it's pretty okay, but I'm not. It's not a high pick, I guess, is what I would say.
The way that I draft Ranger right now, I feel like Seek Horizon Red disappears from the packs before I even like have a chance to pick them. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't think I have drafted a Seek Horizon Red in like 7 drafts or something like that. Like I just haven't been able to pick one up since then. So I actually can't say on this card. I pick Ravenous Rabble red and Scout the Prefries red very highly, and then I just pick arrows over Seek Horizon right now. So
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure. I haven't played with this card in a while.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like other people value this card a lot more than I do. I would be happy to pick it up like maybe picks like 7 and onwards, somewhere in there. Like I'm not wanting to spend my first 5 picks on this card. Ideally, you can if you need flexibility. It's okay. Maybe at the start of the draft it's generic, but like it's not a card that I'm in love with. But it is okay in Ranger.
I think a card that I personally like. I know that a lot of people won't like this card. Can you guess which card I'm gonna say? Is a generic.
In Ranger or just in general.
Just in Ranger. Like in Ranger, I liked it in almost every deck so far, but just in Ranger as well.
Come to fight.
Nah, freewheeling renegades.
Yeah, Jay loves freewheeling Renegade Red. I think you've actually converted me. I think that the card's very good. I like it a lot in Ninja. I also like it in Assassin, although I think it's maybe a little better in what's his name, Arachne.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I like it in Riptide, but I don't think you want this card in Azalea.
Oh, I think okay, I would agree with that. Which is also the reason why I would never draft Azalea at this point, because I pick freewheeling renegades ridiculously highly now. Where after, so in Vancouver, I we draft quite a bit in Vancouver here, and I think all the guys okay, I talk about what cards I like, what cards I don't like very openly to everyone here. And I've mentioned Free Ruling Renegades Red is like probably my favorite generic to almost everybody here now. And now they all pick red Free Ruling Renegades, so they don't wheel anymore. So now I have to pick them really highly just for me to be able to play with it. And it's like I'm just at this like really weird dilemma where if I just kept my mouth shut and not talked about this card, maybe I would have like better draft experiences playing red freewheeling renegades all the time. Like if I can get this on the wheel, I'm like I feel like my deck's insane.
Yeah, I think the card is pretty underrated at the moment. I have a couple questions for you. First off, for people that maybe aren't on this card yet or are a little low on this card, which from what I gather is actually quite a few people, what's so good about it?
This card forces awkward blocks from your opponent no matter what. There are obviously times where the card that we're gonna block with was or happens to be an action card anyways, and in those spots, this card is just a 1 for 4, which means it's honestly it's like slightly worse than Red Spring Load, but it's not like the worst, right? Like a 1 cost for 4 is not like the most, let's say, what's it called? It's not the most embarrassing you can do in this format.
Mm-hmm.
But on the upside of when you attack like a ranger or even an assassin, and the card that they were gonna block with happens to be a non-action card, so like a defense reaction or an attack reaction, or even on a turn where let's say a ninja wanted to keep like a 4 card hand, this card basically says no, you cannot keep a 4 card hand no matter what, and no, you cannot just keep your blue Razor's Edge, or you can't just use your trap, or you lose a lot of value to this card. Freewheeling Renegades does not trigger any of the traps in this format, like zero. Like all the traps. Actually, I actually don't know about the mythic traps, but
No, they have the same triggers. They have the same triggers.
okay, then none of the traps trigger on Freewheeling Renegades, so Riptide never gets value off it. If your assassin opponent tries to block with Razor's Edge, it like they can't. They have to use a stealth card that they wanted the Razor's Edge on, so it breaks up their hand. Otherwise, they might need to give you a 2 block attack action that's like what's it called? Like that they wanted to use. Like simply said, like this card just breaks up awkward hands if your opponent is trying to block with a non-attack action or action card, or if they just wanted to use like equipment to block you or something. It basically says no.
Yeah.
And a card that just says this card must be blocked is just good. Like cut down to size is good because of that. And destructive deliberation is pretty good because of that. And unlike feisty locals where your opponent has to go no blocks, This is the other way around, where this card basically has to be blocked, and there's a condition on what card they have to block with, which is why I like this card a lot.
Yeah, I agree. You kind of outlined how the not being shut off by reactions can be really awkward. Like sometimes you have only two actions. One of them is your pitch card, one of them is your attack that you want to play, and you either like it just there's no profitable way to block this card, and it actually is just a 1 for 6, and the times when it is that, it's really impressive. And I agree with you that when it's a 4 for 1, it's still pretty solid. So I think that Freewheeling Renegade's a pretty good card, but don't play it in Azalea. No good there.
That's fair. That's fair.
I have one more question about this card for you before we move on. Short answer: red spring loaded or red freewheeling renegade?
I don't know. I just like both of them. In Riptide, exactly, red freeling renegades every time, just because it's hard to empty your hand. And freeling renegades is it's just like, oh, it's always a 1 for 4. In Ninja, I think Spring Load is a little bit better, just because you can consistently do 1 for 7s. And then in Assassins, I actually don't care.
Yeah, fair enough. I've actually found spring load pretty good in Riptide because you can like block with a card, spring load from hand, trigger Riptide, load your card, then it gets the buff. It's pretty sweet.
Oh yeah. That is pretty cool. That is pretty cool.
uh, I agree with you. Its best home is probably Ninja, but I think that the Riptide trigger makes it surprisingly less awkward than you might think.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'll be pretty happy with playing red copies of either of them in the Riptide deck. Honestly.
Yeah, and I realized that we left Come to Fight. I kind of guessed that card. We left it off the list. That should definitely be on here too. The red one is a good pump. It's a block 3 that doesn't get debuffed by Spider's Bites, and I think that the yellow and blues are just good blocking resource cards. So I'm pretty happy with Come to Fights as well.
Yeah, that card good in every deck, all 6 decks. Okay, let's move on to class cards that both you really want.
Yeah, so I think the big takeaway is that frailty tokens feel like the most important token in Ranger because they turn off Kodachis and they turn off, maybe even more notably, Spider's Bites. I think that both of these weapons are pretty hard for Ranger to deal with. If your opponent is just swinging their weapons every single turn, it's actually pretty hard to beat. If they're just like blocking, doing stuff on rate, swinging their weapons, like the weapon value will grind you out. And your biggest way to combat this is with frailty tokens. And so that means that your Lace with Frailties, as well as your Withering Shot, especially like the red and yellow Withering Shot, since they come in for the breakpoints, but even the blue comes in for a breakpoint with a name counter on it, are really good and really premium in both of these decks. And just, yeah, very high priority if you're Ranger.
I think one more note would be, in this format, shooting an arrow for 6 is pretty different from shooting an arrow for 5. I feel like because a lot of the cards in this format block for 2, if you shoot an arrow for 6, you sometimes can get 3 cards out of their hand, which is a good note to just make sure that, like, if you can put an aim counter on it, you should almost always put an aim counter on it, even if that means even if it doesn't seem like, putting an attack from 5 to 6 doesn't feel that impactful because you're more used to classic constructed. In this format, because so many cards block for 2, if you can push it one more to 6, it's worth it a lot of the times.
After the frailty stuff, I think the blood rot stuff is also very good, and I think most people are on this. Lace with blood rot, infecting shot, again, red, yellow, premium, blue, still pretty good. I think you really do need some amount of frailty to have a very strong Ranger deck, but I think that blood rot is also just really good. It pushes a ton of damage, is a lot of value, and it really does incentivize your opponent to block. And I think that's kind of the key here. You want your opponents to be blocking you because then they're not swinging their entire hand at you.
And last card on this list is Widowmaker. For those that don't know, Widowmaker is the arrow that defense reaction cannot be played against this card, and if this card isn't blocked by 2 cards, it has +3, and it hacks for 4 for the red one, 3 for the yellow, 2 for the blue. So hits for 7, 6, or 5. Why do you think this card is good in both decks?
In Azalea, obviously, with Dominate, it's very strong. They have access to at most two equipment that can block one, the headpiece and the gloves, depending on the class. They all have a head and a gloves. But especially in multiples, you tend to eat through this. And like we mentioned, sometimes the six power breakpoint, or sometimes I don't know, you come in for sevens with a pump or whatever, like because of your breakpoints and your on hits with withering and infecting shot, and your Widowmaker is kind of all demanding their equipment, you tend to chew through it pretty quickly. And Widowmaker is a really solid finisher. The red one just coming in for 7 and denying defense reactions is really good in the late game. And similarly, the yellow and the blue ones are just like high power yellow and blues that you can pitch. So I think that these are really, really good in Azalea. And then do you want to talk about why they're so good in Riptide?
Yeah, so this is just like not a theory, but when you attack with Widowmaker without it having Dominate, your opponent has to give you two cards. And this makes the yellow Widowmaker and the blue Widowmaker very powerful in Riptide, as when you attack with them, it still demands two cards from your opponent, unlike um, unlike a blue Withering Shot or a blue Infecting Shot, where they can sometimes block it out with just one card. And this for fatigue math, this is very important. If your opponent is using two cards to block out one card, like one physical card, you can end up fatiguing your opponent as Riptide. And we'll talk about why this is important a little bit later when we talk about Riptide. But if you can guess, Riptide, you just want to, I think, fatigue people out if possible. And this is one of the key cards that let you do that, not for free, but like it really helps with that strategy.
Yeah, just having a blue that's essentially a two card block or a yellow that's a two card block is so good. And much like how we talked about how the text on Freewheeling Renegades is good, Widowmaker kind of has the same text. They can use attack reactions, but they cannot use defense reactions. And sometimes, if your opponent has a hand with a defense reaction in it, and you go, give me two cards that aren't that defense reaction, it's pretty hard for them to have a good turn after that. And so, I've also really liked Widowmaker for that reason.
Let's move on and talk about Azalea next. So how, as I said, like I don't like Azalea too much, and you're more on the Azalea train. How do you like to build your Azalea decks?
So I think Azalea wants to be pretty strict about the cards that is included in it. I guess I can kind of start with a deck outline and then go from there. But I think you really want a good number of arrows, mostly red and yellow, especially on hits. We mentioned the infecting and the withering shots. And I think you want to have about 20-ish arrows, like 18 to 20 range. If you don't have this density, it's just hard to find them on top. Even though you have cards that look at the top of the deck, they don't opt in this format really, aside from the Seeker's equipment. And because of that, like you just need the arrow density or you're not going to find the arrows. They're also the cards that block best in the deck. So if you end up not having arrows on top, you can block, and that's great. And then I think you want 10 cards with Go Again. So that's like Rabbles and Pumps primarily. And I think you want at least or you want about 7 of those to be pumps. So I'd ideally have like a few Rabbles and some pumps. If you don't have the Rabbles, you can go with like a few more arrows, I would say. But usually I don't want more than like 7, 8 pumps or so, because you just start having these hands that are all pumps and they all block for 2 and you have nothing to pump. And that's really, really awkward. And I think because so many of the pumps hit arrows, you also like you don't Ravenous Rabble is really good because it has Go Again, it lets you see the top card of your deck and all of that's great. But I think other attacks that aren't arrows just don't really fit into what you're trying to do in this deck. Also notably, I think that Toxicity is a pretty good card in Azalea because Dominate allows you to hit with it, especially the yellow and blue. You can pitch stack it for a late game. But I think you want at least like 5 or so pumps that are not Toxicity, because if your only pumps are Toxicity, you just have trouble getting over defense reactions and forcing through your on hits. So you can have a few toxicities to supplement that number, but you don't want them to all be toxicities. Also, it's a rare. You're probably not going to get too many.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Other than that, so is this a deck that you want 30 cards exactly?
I think so. I think it's pretty hard to want to play more than 30 cards just because you have like very specific parts and you I think that when this deck is functioning, you don't have like when it's humming, when you have a good version of it, you don't really have issues with fatigue. And because of that, I think you just want 30 cards to be more consistent and see your best cards more often.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I guess you're like really trying to dominate like every turn or every other turn as long as you can see a good arrow on top, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. So the key parts to this deck, we talked about the pumps, we talked about the arrows. It's a lot of what you'd expect. I think for the pumps, you want mostly zero costs. So the laces are very good, of course. Scout the Periphery gives you information about the top of the deck, which is great. Toxicity is also good. That's the one where if your next ranger or assassin attack hits, they lose life. I especially like the yellow and the blue because you can pitch stack it for an end game. Azalea, I think, is quite hard to pilot and often goes second cycle, and having some toxicity as a pitch card that enables these end games, I think, is pretty important. And then finally, the come to fights and fletches are serviceable, but I think you'd really rather have the zero cost pumps.
I see a note on here that says traps, death touch, verlin are playable but best versions probably don't have any. Have many of these. So what do you mean by that? Like it's like you rather just not have these and just have more arrows and like
Yeah.
you want more all in on your plan here?
Yeah, exactly. Like you kind of think about the CC Azalea decks right now. They're running basically rabbles, pumps, and arrows. And I think you want to be doing the same thing here. You just want to be as consistent as possible. And I think the best decks aren't playing these cards. I actually think that the more cards you have that aren't arrows or pumps, the more you're going to lead to these spots where you look at a card on top and it's just not the arrow that you need, and you kind of get yourself into trouble. So I think that you really want to. Honestly, I'm often happy playing just like no traps, no death touch, no virulent touch. If I have a red death touch, I'll probably play it. I think the card's just like so crazy that you should probably play it in draft, but it's a lot worse in Azalea than it is in, I think, any of the other assassins or rangers.
That makes sense. I have a question about some of the mythics in the set then. What do you think about codex? Typically Codex of Inertia and Codex of Blood Rot. Those two.
I guess I haven't had a chance to play with them. I think Inertia would be pretty hard to use in Azalea because you geez, like you would need to have information about the top of your deck. I guess it's fine, like you could pitch it if nothing else, but it doesn't strike me as great. Blood Rot's probably fine. It's just like a free load plus a Blood Rot plus a Ponder. I think Blood Rot Codex would be really strong and limited, and Frailty is also just fine. You can get a I don't know, a Withering Shot or Infecting Shot or something.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, Codex of Frailty is a little bit messed up and limited, and that one's pretty easy to figure out. But yeah, I guess yeah, I think I'm on the same train. I think Inertia, Codex of Inertia, is a little bit harder to play in limited, and yeah, I think Codex of Blood Rod probably does fit in this deck pretty well. I've never played with them either, but I was just wondering what your thoughts on that was.
I think the other cards you want in Azalea, so we mentioned the pumps. The arrows are mostly the ones we talked about, Withering, Infecting, and Widowmaker. But I think you also want some number of Spire Snipings in your deck. I think because you often will activate Azalea after using Spire Sniping, you can actually kind of recycle these, and I don't think you need too many. Like, they don't do anything on hit. And honestly, I think yellow might be the best one. It comes in for a breakpoint, but it's also a pitch card. It's just very flexible. And I think if I have like like 2 to 4 range is pretty good for Spire Sniping. One of the lines to be aware of if you have Spire Sniping, I guess the reason this card's so important is you get to look at the top 2 cards of your deck and you get to rearrange them. So this is not an opt, but it does give you information about the top of your deck and if you should be Azaleaing. And I think you don't want to be doing blind Azaleas unless you absolutely have to. Like you really want to be doing it because you know there's an arrow on top, and spire sniping is a key part of this. And one of the nicest things about spire sniping is that I think you need to be careful about arsenaling arrows in general in the format, because they get kind of like, if you can't get information about the top of the deck, you have an arrow in your arsenal and you just kind of have to fire the arrow. And if it's like a red withering or like a premium arrow, it's fine. But the nice thing about spire sniping is you can actually activate what is it, barbed castaway, to put an aim counter on it to flip it, and then that lets you trigger it and look at the top two cards of your deck. And notably, you can actually do this on your opponent's turn because it's an instant. So I think that spire sniping combined with spire sniping and arsenal combined with the seeker's equipment is really, really powerful, because you can activate a seeker's equipment to opt. Then if it's not an arrow, you can put it to the bottom, flip your spire sniping with like a, if let's say you pitch it yellow, flip your spire sniping, and now you have looked at 3 cards to find an arrow, so you're pretty likely to find one. And additionally, you've done it on your opponent's turn, so if they are presenting damage and you don't have the arrow on top, you can potentially block with more of your hand than you might have otherwise. Like if you're really relying on having that arrow on top, I think you can run into trouble hoping that there's an arrow on top because you have spire sniping or scout or rabble to look at it, but then you find out on your turn that there isn't and your turn's just really bad. I think if you notice those turns coming up, you want to try and get information on your opponent's turn ideally, and being able to like stop a spider's bite with your seekers and then get to look at more cards and get basically full information before you commit to any blocks is just really good. And I think a big difference between the so-so Azalea decks and the really good ones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, being able to just like choose and pick when to block and when not to block, dependent on the information you get, is pretty big game. And it's without the Seeker's equipment, it's really awkward to just flip over your Spire sniping. So the Seeker is important, very important in this math.
Yeah, I think my ideal setup, the Wayfinder's Crest is really good because you can, that's the Ranger hood that when you block with it, you get to see a card on top. It's good for the same reason. But I think my ideal equipment might be like Seeker's Chest, Seeker's Legs, and Wayfinders. And then I'm pretty happy with either Toxic Tips or the Seeker's Gloves. I think are both pretty good. Toxic Tips is quite nice because if you ever have dominated an extra resource, you can get one of the on hits, and it's also just an armor. But I think Seekers is like surprisingly close. Like if you run 4 Seekers in Azalea, it actually feels pretty good, and it's one of the better ways to block out Spider's Bite, which also lets you leverage your 3 block arrows. So I think Seekers is kind of a key to a good Azalea deck, along with kind of the other top of deck cards that we mentioned, the Scouts, the Spire Snipings, the Rapples, and the Seeker's Crest, or Wayfinder's Crest, sorry.
Well, anything else you want to talk about Azalea before we talk about going first or second?
I'll say that I think that Azalea can get by with surprisingly, like you need to have the pumps and the arrows, but I've been decently impressed with, like I've had Azalea decks that have like mostly yellow arrows, and as long as some of those are your on hits, you'd be surprised at how functional the deck is. I think that it is quite solid and can get away. You don't have to have the most amazing card quality so long as you have the right mix of cards and all the right parts in the deck is kind of what I found. It feels like it's like very particular about what it wants, but so long as you have them, if you have a little bit more yellow and a little bit more blue, like the deck is still probably okay, although the reds are obviously premium.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I think that's the case with both Rangers actually, where I think the yellow arrows, like obviously they're not as good in Classic Constructed, but in Draft they're very comparable, and most of the power on these cards are the on hits, and as long as that on hits text doesn't change, it's pretty powerful. Like the frailty token sometimes providing like 3 points of value is pretty insane. The blood rot token providing 2 points of value almost every time is just insane. So yeah, the on hits on these arrows are very good in this format.
Absolutely. And I think as Azalea, you're really looking to kind of force through a good dominated turn like 3 times in the game. And that's usually kind of enough to either close out the game or force your opponent to just block with their whole hand, which makes it really easy to set up. So don't be afraid to block. Pick your spots where you're taking your big turns carefully because your life goes by pretty quick if you're not blocking and kind of gambling on hands, even if it's hands where you get the information on your turn. You really just got to pick your spots really, really carefully. And don't be afraid to set something up second cycle, especially if it's versus an assassin. You can kind of do the. We'll talk about Riptide's game plan, but you can kind of do the Riptide thing where you like block with some of your arrows, come in with a withering shot for 6, and that's like pretty good. And unlike classic constructed, like if you're not ending on an arsenal, it's really not the end of the world. It's actually kind of okay. It's not like you have Skullbone Crosswrap to, opt one and get all this card selection. You're pretty okay ending without an arsenal if you have to. Although a go again in arsenal or a premium red arrow in arsenal is always nice.
Okay, then our usual question: do you want to go first or second with Azalea?
I think I think it comes down to how good you are at getting information about the top of your deck. I think if you have like the more spire snipings, the more scouts, the more rabbles you have, the more I want to go first. The less that you have this stuff, the more that I might just want to go second and make sure that I'm presenting good damage. I guess I'd say that like the good Azalea decks can really benefit from going first. I've definitely had turns where, like I load a spire sniping, I play a scout, and then I play a toxicity and flip into a withering shot, and my opponent takes like 10 damage and has a frailty token, and it just feels like the game's over. So I think that the upside of going, like, that's obviously close to the ceiling, but I think that the upside of going first, if you have a good Azalea deck, is pretty absurd. And the deck is still honestly pretty good going second. So, like, just even if you don't hit the dominate and you just come in for 8 with a withering shot or 8 with an infecting shot, like, and you get an arsenal, that's a pretty good turn going second. So I think you're actually pretty happy either way. But if you have a very good version of the deck, going first is often nice.
Yeah, the other upside about doing exactly what you said, going first, like the high roll, is that your opponent will complain about it for the rest of the format. So, yeah, the example you used, yeah, yeah, he was talking about it the whole day, right?
Yeah, for sure. I do think that the decision gets a little more interesting if you're against a super aggressive deck. So if it's a deck that you don't want to fall behind against, like a ninja, I'm not sure. It's a lot closer. I might consider going second, even if I have a good deck. I think Azalea is pretty good going either first or second, but yeah, sometimes you got to make sure that you don't fall too far behind.
Yeah. So I guess a question would be like, if you're against, let's say, Benji or Katsu, would you choose to go second? Is that would that be more of your?
I think I would lean that way unless I felt like my deck was especially consistent at getting cards on top. So if I have like a very high number of spire snipings and scouts and etc., then maybe I might lean that way. But I also just feel like going second's pretty good. Yeah. Sometimes you can even load an arrow on your opponent's turn. Barb Castaway is an instant. I'd be careful about taking too much damage doing it, but if they use up their action point or they've shown you, maybe because the way that they've pitched that they can't present that much, yeah, I'm happy to load an arrow if it's a good one.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, let's move on to Riptide. I guess I'll talk about Riptide. I've been drafting. When I am drafting Ranger, I'm typically on Riptide now. Where do I start? I think I'm just gonna talk about the playstyle first. Riptide is, I think, by core gonna be a fatigue deck. There, when you try and play any other ranger as like a fair deck where you're just attacking with regular attacks slash go again, or just using like, if you're only doing like rabble arrow every turn, you're gonna end up losing out just to like the assassins and the ninja decks, because they are more aggressive and they can convert their hands a lot better than you. So in this format, I feel like you end up being a fatigue deck most of the time. There might be some exceptions if your whole deck is only red arrows and you only have pumps and only red rabbles. Obviously you can do something better, but that's just not the case in a lot of drafts. And I think because of that, you end up being a fatigue deck.
Yeah. And how does Riptide usually end up fatiguing people? Like what does the gameplay look like? Are you doing like an Oldham, or how are you fatiguing people as Riptide?
A very big note to make would be you do not have a weapon. Um, so you do need to make sure you have enough damage left in your deck once your opponent is out of cards.
Yeah.
So yes, you are actually slightly closer to like an Oldham strategy where you're making sure you're blocking and getting full value of your blocks. I think is something that's going to be very important in Riptide. And to do that, what I find that's important is to make sure you have Come to Fight, which is a 3 block generic, and Traps, because these cards don't get debuffed by Spider's Bite. As long as you have enough copies of these, you can actually block out assassins because their stealth cards typically only attack for 3. So you can use Come to Fight to block it, and if they use like a Razor's Edge, you can use a defense reaction to cover that up as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting where as long as if you're attacking for like 5 or 6 with an arrow every turn, and you're either going to be chipping them down and they're going to have to start blocking pretty quick, or if they're blocking with 2 cards, you kind of turn off their spiders bites. Like there's a limit to how much they can spiders bite you, because if they block with 2 cards and they spiders bite and attack you with a stealth card, like it's not very threatening. So kind of by presenting that like 5 or 6 power attack over and over again, you sort of indirectly deal with the spider's bites, and then having the few like some defense reactions and some come to fights to deal with, like when they do, maybe if they take damage, to try and push spider's bites in a bigger hand that you're also equipped to deal with it. I think is kind of what you want to be doing to kind of deal with that threat of that weapon.
Yeah, I think the key to this is that all of your attacks needs to be threatening some kind of on hit to force your opponent to block. Riptide will typically lose if you give your opponent a 4 card hand 2 or 3 times during the game. So you just need to prevent that from happening one way or another, or you have to give them an frailty token. So then their weapons stop doing damage and it's harder for them to convert their hand into value. Um, just going back to your question of like how you actually end up fatiguing your opponent in Riptide is, as you said, the arrows. All of your arrows are actually pretty high on rate. If you look at the card, just like if you ignore that it's an arrow, all the arrows are actually pretty broken. They're all 1/4/5s with an on hit that blocks for 3. So as long as you are attacking with an arrow with an on hit every turn, and your opponent is giving you 2 cards for your 1 card, you end up going up 1 card in your deck. And if you keep on doing this, and if you need to have about 10 arrows, I think, in your deck with on hits for this to be pretty good. Then you can be up 10 cards on your opponent. And once you're up 10 cards on your opponent, if they're playing about a 30 card deck, and you should have 10 cards over them. If you have 10 cards over them, that's each arrow that's left in your deck should be, if it's a blue arrow, I'm assuming, because it's going to be your second cycle and you're going to have mostly blue and yellow arrows, that it's going to be about 30 damage total that you should have over your opponent. This can get easily countered by your opponent putting in 5 more cards in their deck. And it can also be countered by your opponent saving cards in your deck by attacking with their weapons, even if that means doing less damage on that turn. And to prevent all of these things, all you have to do is play about 5 to 7 more cards in your deck. So you have 20 damage more than your opponent at the end of the game. This is just like a long-winded way of saying, if you're playing Riptide, you need to have 35 cards in your deck. If your opponent is playing pretty perfect, if you have less than 35 cards, you are going to fatigue out before your opponent.
Yeah, and I think that I think that the bad Riptide deck is probably the worst deck in the format. If you have like a 32 card Riptide deck with like okay-ish card quality but not great, like that deck is going to 1-2 pretty often if it's a strong pot, I think. So yeah, we'll talk about how to get into Ranger later, but Riptide, like you really do need the card count, and some pretty solid amount of damage in your deck. So you're just looking for like high power reds and yellows in your deck. There's other things too, but you want a good amount of high power reds and yellows, even if they're your like cut down to sizes, freewheeling renegades. Spring load is pretty good in Riptide because it triggers the Riptide ability and you can load the card to get the third card out of your hand potentially. But I think you want to, yeah, you want to be able to present damage. I guess the generics are not as good as the arrows, but they're still serviceable.
Yeah. And honestly, any generics that block for 2 end up being okay just because they block for 2 and you need like just that physical card quantity in your deck, and just like a blue freed reeling renegade still blocks for 2, so it's a card you probably just want in your deck so you can keep your life total just a little bit higher when you deck out your opponent.
Yeah, and it also just attacks for 4 unless they block, which is pretty good. Like blue cut down to size also pretty nice for that reason. You just come in for 4 and you go give me a card and you probably leak a damage or two. It's pretty nice.
Honestly, in Riptide, you just play every generic. Every generic is pretty playable other than Blue Brush Off. I think Blue Brush Off is the only one that I would actively avoid. Blue Feisty Locals is a little bit sus as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say blue feisty locals is really not great.
Yeah, that card. Honestly, I don't even want red feisty locals in Riptide. It's like I don't really care about leaking damage because all of my cards leak damage most of the time, and if your opponent is incentivized not to block and keep a 4-card hand, as I said earlier, if your opponent keeps a 4-card hand too many times, you just blow up, and you can't just blow up. You don't want to lose.
So just going through our notes, I think we've talked about generics and ranger cards. Do you want to talk about traps? First off, you mentioned them being important. Which traps are you looking for? Are there certain ones that are better? Yeah, which are the premium traps?
I'll go over most of the traps that are good. I'm just gonna be talking about the rares and the commons, but before I do that, I just want to make sure and be very clear. Collapsing trap is the best trap. It's a mythic trap. It's a Riptide specialization, and this just reads when this defends an attack with go again, the attacking hero discards their hand and draws that many cards -1. As I said, this is a fatigue deck, and when you get to rip 2 cards out of your opponent's deck, your opponent basically has no way of winning. So, or if you play pretty perfect, and you collapsing trap and trigger them, and your opponent discards 1 or 2 cards, you are most likely going to win because of that 1 or 2 cards. But otherwise, I think the best traps are all the traps that trigger off of go again. So that's going to be Tar Pit Trap as the rare trap that stops the on hits, and Frailty Trap, which gives your opponent a Frailty token, which is honestly premium. Like if your opponent attacks with a Kodachi, you can still Frailty Trap the Kodachi and give them a Frailty token, and it'll stop their second Kodachi from doing damage. And I think those 2 traps are going to be your most premium traps in Riptide, as they're the easiest to trigger to do the 1 extra damage.
Yeah, I just want to jump in about the frailty trap on Kodachi. I get that this can feel bad because you're like, I'm using a 3 block on a Kodachi, but you're actually still getting 3 points of value out of that card because you stop 2 Kodachis, you ping them for 1, and you might even get a 4th point of value if they have a card in Arsenal that they wanted to play. So it's actually like one of the only on rate or potentially even above rate ways to block Kodachis, which is really good.
Yes, yes. And by whatever mistake, if your opponent attacks from their arsenal first for 4, by pitching a card, like let's say like a Twin Twisters red hitting for 4, and you frailty trap them, it's like a blowout. Like I don't even know how Ninja can come back from that. Like you block out the Twin Twisters completely because the frailty will give it a -1. And then all their Kodachi stop attacking you as well, and you still ping them for 1 because that card has go again. I think the next ones that are to talk about would be Inertia Trap, or the traps that trigger off of greater power. This is particularly good against Ninja and Assassin, and also has It actually triggers off of Ranger as well, so it can trigger off all 6 decks. So to do the 1 extra damage. The inertia token that it makes is honestly not that relevant, but the 1 damage is. And
Ooh,
Boulder Trap.
I don't agree. I think inertia is not relevant until it's irrelevant, and then it's insane. I think I'm low on inertia in general, but I think that inertia trap in particular is really good because sometimes you just get a card, and whenever you get a card, it's just broken. Like if they have a card in arsenal and they Kodachi spring load and you trigger inertia trap, get rid of their arsenal, and they just don't have an action point to do anything about it, like it's gross. So I think inertia trap is like it's not going to happen all the time, but man, when it does happen, it's insane.
Yeah, I think I agree with you with that. When you do rip a card with Inertia Trap, you feel like you've done something insane. But I feel like maybe like 8 times out of 10, you'd never rip a card out of this. And
Yeah.
whenever you trigger to Riptide's ability to deal 1 damage, that feels already good enough. That's where I'm
Mhm.
coming from essentially.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I agree with you. I just wanted to say that like I think inertia traps upside while situational is pretty big. That's all. I
Yeah,
agree that's mostly about the 3 block that triggers Riptide though.
yeah, I feel like you shouldn't play towards trying to get somebody with inertia trap, because
Yeah.
if you're doing that, you're gonna lose too much value. But if you do randomly get it, you've done something. Like you've wrecked someone's turn or the tournament.
Yeah. And there's actually some like kind of cute stuff that you can do in this format with the inertia trap or the traps that trigger off higher power. There's stuff like spider's bites have piercing 1, and if your opponent's at 1, you can potentially block a spider's bite with an equipment to give it higher power and trigger the trap on it. I've had a number of games closed by opponents playing feisty locals, and you can block it with an action to trigger feisty locals, and then you inertia trap it. So there's these spots where you can kind of turn on your opponent's plus attack when they're not expecting it, and then get your trigger. And it's just something to be aware of. I think whether you're playing against Riptide or you're playing as Riptide, is that can get you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, if you can trigger the greater power, you it might be worth it. Just be aware of how many cards are left in your deck. Just be aware of just how many cards you're using to do that. Or if your turn becomes very inefficient when you do that, you might not want to do that. But just as an option, you should have that in the back of your mind for sure.
Yeah, no, don't definitely. I think more often than not, you don't want to do these things, but there will be spots where it's relevant, and it's when it is, it's really relevant.
That's fair. Uh, I was gonna move on to Boulder Trap, which has the same condition as Inertia Trap. It's greater power. The -1 counter, if you get it, feels like a blowout, but most equipment in the set doesn't block. So I've had a lot of situations where my Boulder Trap resolves, and I'm putting the -1 counter on their Fleetfoot sandals. Um, but it still pings for 1. So just don't remember. Just always remember to ping for 1. I think that's gonna be very important with Riptide. And in the last category is gonna be the if your opponent used an attack reaction, uh, then it triggers traps. This is a pendulum trap, and this is
Blood rot.
blood rot trap. Thank you. These ones have the highest upsides. Just on its own, blood rot trap just basically says deal 2 damage, meaning that if you end up blocking with it, you get the trigger. They take 1 from Riptide, they take 2 from the blood rot. So this blocks for 3 and deals 3 damage. So this is a 0 for 6. If it triggers, it is just broken. Um, there is no attack reaction in Ranger. The only attack reaction that they could ever play is a card called Fisticuffs, and it's going to be face up on the board. It will be pretty face up when they want to use it, so if you can line up your 1 Blood Rot trap to their Fisticuffs, you should probably try and do so. Otherwise, you can assume that you will never be able to trigger Blood Rot trap against the Ranger Mirror.
I feel like in general, I don't know about you, but with these reaction traps, like if you can trigger them, fantastic. But even against ninja and assassin, it's conditional enough that like I'm not going out of my way. Like I'm pretty happy to just use them as a block 3. And if it lines up, then it lines up.
Yeah, I think Pendulum Trap is actually not so. Because I keep on saying I play Riptide as a fatigue deck, and Pendulum Trap reads when you trigger it, your opponent puts the top two cards of their deck into their graveyard, which is pretty significant. And I would go out of my way to like try and pitch stack Pendulum Trap until I can see a spot where against Ninja and Assassin, where I can force my opponent to activate a attack reaction to line the Pendulum Trap up to that if possible. And when you do get to trigger Pendulum Trap, it's, as I said with Collapsing Trap, it feels like a win, but it's just a lot harder to set that up.
Yeah, I guess I found it hard just because usually like you end up pitching it so your opponent's aware of it and they probably like ideally should be taking note of it. There's some cute stuff you can do like with Riptide's Quiver to hide a trap. If you put a trap in Arsenal and there's not a good spot for it and they're not pressuring you that much, sometimes you can just like hide a trap on the bottom. And typically the majestic traps or these reaction traps are some of the best ones to hide, especially if you know that they have attack reactions that they've pitched. But yeah, you don't want to go out of your way doing that because it's really bad in terms of like card economy. You're basically just getting rid of a card, so you just need to be in a spot where you happen to have extra cards, and it's something that you can do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I think it's not worth taking 3 damage to save a trap,
No,
but
absolutely not.
it might be worth taking 1 damage to save a trap. So I think that might be the line. At 2, you have to really evaluate the situation, um, case by case. Like how much life total are you at? How much life total are they at? How many cards do you have in your deck? How many cards do they have in their deck? And I feel like Riptide is probably one of the harder decks to play. Maybe just under Azalea. I think Ranger might be the hardest decks to pilot in this format.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think they're both quite hard. They both often go to second cycle, and your second cycle matters a lot. So yeah, I think they are both pretty challenging decks to pilot.
Yeah. I think one of the key things about Riptide is pitching red arrows. If you aren't pitching red arrows, like infecting shots and frailty shots, you're going to have a bad time in second cycle. And then if you're not properly pitch stacking, it's called withering shot. Yeah. But if you're not pitching these red arrows to the bottom of the deck for your second cycle, you're going to be in these spots where a blue arrow attacking for 4 gets covered up by 2 cards, and then you could be in a spot where you're going to end up blocking against Kodachi because you're at 1. At that point, you can never win. So
Yeah. So, anyways, so kind of talking about traps, just wrapping up our discussion there. How many traps do you ideally have in your Riptide deck?
that's a good question. I would play as many as I can get. Typically, when I draft Riptide, I'm not really looking for any specific numbers on honestly any kind of card. I'm just trying to get my deck count up. So as long as it's playable, it will make my deck. Like if I
Right.
have like a 10 or 11 trap deck, I think I'll be pretty happy with that. If I have like a 4 trap deck, I'll also be pretty happy with that. As long as I have that 35 plus cards in my deck.
Right. And where do you think traps fall in the like how are you prioritizing traps compared to let's say like the red and yellow arrows that we've talked about?
The traps get, I think the priority of cards that I'm looking for in this deck is the red withering shots and the yellow withering shots at the very top, the red and yellow infecting shots next, and then I'm going to be looking at most of the traps, the ones that are easily triggered, so the non-reaction traps. I have Widowmaker right under that, and then I have the reaction traps under that. I'm only talking about the commons here. I had this discussion with Yuki as well, but now comes the question of where do I take the pumps? That is a good question for me. I typically like to have traps and infecting shots before the pumps. Like I don't prioritize the pumps that much in Riptide. Um, but having them does give you a big boost in your deck, and I would be pretty happy with like a Lace with Frailty or a Lace with Blood Rot in my deck. But honestly, it's not that high of a pick for me.
Yeah. I think by contrast, I'm actually a little bit higher than Jay on the pumps. And I think Maybe part of the reason for me is that I've been I've been burned sometimes for going into Riptide when it seems like Ranger's kind of open, but then it's not quite open enough for me to actually have the 35 plus cards that I need. And I just wind up with this mediocre 32 card Riptide deck that I mentioned earlier. And this is something I really want to avoid. So for me, I am looking to get some of the pumps early, or pick them up when I can, just to give myself outs to being Azalea, because a lot of the core of the deck is the same. Like you want a lot of those premium arrows, and if you have a few pumps and some good arrow count, like you have outs to be Azalea if it doesn't feel like Ranger is open enough. And I guess by open enough, I feel like you need to be getting reasonable enough cards past the wheel. If you're getting to like pick 10, 11, and you're getting past a whole bunch of ninja cards and you can't play any of them, like you're going to have a really hard time playing Riptide, and you don't want to put yourself in that spot. So I think the way I've been mitigating that is by giving myself pumps so that I can pivot into Azalea if I need to. How have you been kind of avoiding that trap of the mediocre Riptide pool?
What I typically do is so on the earlier packs, I would be counting up how many ranger cards that I would want, and then I would also point out, or like mentally point out, which ranger cards should be taken if there is another ranger player. And then I just make sure that there is enough ranger cards in the pack so that I would get a last pick ranger card. And if this whole thing is not true, like if I see, let's say if I'm gonna end up passing a yellow infecting shot, and the only other card that would be playable in Ranger would be like a blue generic or something that might wheel. I would typically just not go into Ranger because then I don't want to get into the spot where I get a ninja card in my pool, because that's typically how Riptide loses. I think in Vancouver right now, when there is a Riptide mirror, we just go, "How many cards do you have in your deck?" And I go, "I have 37." And then my opponent goes, "I have 34. I don't want to play this game anymore."
Yeah, the Riptide mirror, it is hard to overcome a larger card count. Like just
Yeah.
raw cards in deck is very good, and I would probably play anything that blocks two in the Riptide mirror.
Yes. And I think just just to make sure that you don't have, like, the worst case scenario with Riptide during the draft portion is being forced to pick up a ninja card on pick 11, 12, 13, 14, something like that. Or like an assassin card on, like basically non cards you physically are not allowed to play in your deck on your last couple of picks. And you can easily mitigate that by just passing cards, ranger cards that other rangers don't, passing cards that go into ranger that people won't go into ranger for. So I'm talking about cards like yellow Markmeyer Grapnel, blue Skybound Shot, blue Sedation Shot. As long as you see these cards in the pack after you pick a card, you should be okay for the wheel in pick 4, 5, 6, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's not something that I've thought about as explicitly, but I like that point, and I think I'm gonna try doing that from now on. Um, I've been trying. I guess like one of the things I've been trying to do is maybe for the first couple packs, count the number of class cards and like hybrids, and just try and then you can kind of figure out like what's missing and get a rough idea of what might be at the table. It's not perfect, but if you remember like the first two packs or so, you often get a pretty good idea of like there were some really good ranger cards in here and only one of them got taken, so there's probably one other ranger at the table kind of thing. So I've been kind of going off of that, but I also like the idea of looking around picks 4, 5, 6 and seeing, is it possible for me to get that wheel, and if not, then I really don't want to be in Riptide. I think that's a really good piece of advice.
I feel like me doing that is like my biggest edge in being able to draft Riptide, at least in our local, and at our locals. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I only go into Riptide when it is open for me and when I think I can get those wheels. So otherwise, I stay away from Ranger altogether.
Yeah.
So I feel like for you to go into Riptide, you have to be one of two Rangers, or else you will run out of cards. Or you have a Belgium print with ridiculous amounts of Ranger cards, which can happen as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm similar that if I'm drafting Ranger, I want it to be really open. I think that Assassin and Ninja just have a little bit higher floor, largely due to the weapons, actually, and that you really just if you're draft like if I'm drafting Ninja, sorry, if I'm drafting Ranger, I want somebody to be hitting me over the head with the deck and saying draft this, draft this, draft this. So like often for me getting like a fourth pick lace or something will be like, okay, I'll take that and see what happens. And then if I continue to see some Ranger cards, I'm like pretty happy to draft Ranger, especially if I have like an early red rabble, which I think is just a high pick anyways. It's, just like a pretty easy way to get into Ranger. Maybe you have a piece of equipment in there. But yeah, for me right now, I think I'm mostly getting into into Ranger with some of the pumps and like maybe generics like Rabble, just because um, that gives me outs to be Azalea, so that my draft is not going to be terrible. Like if in the first pack I have like a Lace and a Scout with Periphery, I feel pretty confident that I have an okay Azalea deck as a safety valve, so long as Ranger is decently open, and I'm okay moving in on that. But in general, I think I'm trying to start more generic lately and give myself more outs to be Assassin and Ninja, which also kind of lets you draft Riptide, right? I think you can kind of start with like the freewheeling renegades, the cut down to sizes that we've been talking about, pick up a couple traps, and you're like pretty set up to maybe play Azuri if you want to. And if you're noticing, hey, Ranger's really flowing, there's good card density there. That's another way that you can get into Ranger. But I think you need to be careful about how you do it. And those are the two ways I've been most comfortable with is generics into traps into yes, Ranger's open, or some kind of flexible generics that go well into Ranger, like maybe some come to fights, rabbles, and then you get like a late lace or something like that, and you can move into Ranger with some pumps.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much the same. The way I get into Riptide is like I have red cut down a size. I start with a come to fight, red ravenous rabble, and it's like it looks like a Nazuri deck, but then Assassin's locked, but then Ranger's open. Then that's my cue to go into like 37 card Riptide.
Yeah, and I think for that reason, I'm a little bit reluctant to draft, even though we mentioned they're really good cards. Infecting Shot, Withering Shot, Widowmaker are not really reasons I want. Like, they're not usually the first Ranger cards I'm picking unless, I don't know, unless I have like a bunch of, like, if I have the generic trap start and I'm getting like a really late Withering Shot and I'm pretty confident Ranger's really open, I'll draft it. But I don't really want to be like, first picking a red Withering Shot. I think you really
First picking a red Withering is that's
yeah,
that
like
says a little.
that's what I'm saying. Like I like or even like second or third picking. Like I maybe if it's a really weak pack, but I think you really need to be careful about getting into Ranger for these arrows because while they're premium cards in the deck, I think if you draft them too highly, you can kind of like pigeonhole yourself into this Ranger deck that like has some good arrows, but you don't have the pumps to be Azalea. And if Ranger's not open enough for you to be Riptide, like you're just gonna have a bad time. So be careful about that. I think you really want to have the generic start, or you want to be getting in with pumps. I think that those are the two safest ways that I've found.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Before we move on anymore, let's just talk about going first or second with Riptide because I think we skipped over that.
It's got to be going second, right?
Actually, I like going first with Riptide.
Really?
Yeah.
I guess it
The
depends.
I would go second against exactly Ninja, and I would go
Yeah.
first against everyone else.
Yeah, I think against aggressive decks you want to go second to force them to block, and then
Yeah.
yeah, maybe go first against. You can't let Azalea go first, and against
Oh,
Assassin,
actually,
especially Azuri.
the main reason why I'm going first against Azalea is so then I can fire any arrow at them, and they use two cards to block. Like I just
Yeah,
reduced
yeah.
their deck count by one on turn 0 essentially. And then because how I draft Riptide, I cannot use a 4 card hand. Going second is actually pretty bad because I draw up to 4, I use 2 cards, and I Arsenal 1, draw 3, which isn't really great.
Mm,
So honestly, going second, actually, I can't force my opponent to block that much, anyways. But if I go and if I my opponent goes first, a lot of the times, I end up needing to block with like 3 cards in my hand, against like assassin, or the other ranger. And then if that's the case, then I'm down on cards on turn 1, and then I have to play the catch up game to try and get more cards out of their deck again. So I'd rather just go first and try and rip cards out of their deck right away.
that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. I think I was thinking of Ninja when I said you got to go second, but I think I agree that yeah, you want to go first against Rangers. You want to go first against certainly Azuri. I think Arachne's interesting. Arachne can be pretty aggressive if you. It's hard to tell. If you think that they're going to try and fatigue you, I think going first is pretty good. If you're worried about them having a really explosive deck, going second might be better. I'm not sure.
The problem with Arachne is that if they go first, if they can do Spiders Bite, you lose 2 cards out of your deck, and they just go past Arsenal. And if you let a Spider's Bite hit, then they can attack you with their one of their stealth cards, and you still lose 2 cards. So you always go down on life, or you go down on cards in deck. So
Okay.
if your Arachne opponent is being conscious that you're a fatigue Riptide deck, and if they put 3 more cards in, and if they go first and go Spiders Bite, you actually get into a spot where you actually gonna they can force the deck out. Like they can force the fatigue if even if they don't have a busted deck.
Okay. That's fair enough. I'll take your word for it. I haven't played the Riptide Arachne matchup, so I'm not
Yeah,
entirely
and
sure.
then if the Arachne deck goes second, and if they have a busted Arachne deck, it's pretty hard to beat anyways. So good luck.
Yeah, fair enough. I think before we wrap up here, the last thing that I want to talk about that we probably should have mentioned somewhere in the Riptide section was that the Riptide reload text is pretty relevant, and I think you want ways to do it. Traps are an obvious way, buffs are another way, and it's just because then you don't have to spend the resource on loading with the bow, and you can instead spend the resource to put an aim counter on the arrow. And I think every arrow in the set gets +1 except for Widowmaker and Spire Sniping.
Yeah, Spire Sniping and Widowmaker is the only one that doesn't.
Yeah. And so if you're able to load for free and then get an extra damage out of your arrow, you know, all of the time or even half of the time, like that extra damage every single time really adds up. And we kind of mentioned the difference between like 5 or 6 being pretty big. Riptide's really good at getting that 6 pretty consistently. So I think that's something you want to be doing. And for that reason, I think that's kind of why I'm a little higher on the Fletch on like the Fletches and the pumps than maybe Jay is. In particular, I've been pretty impressed with the Fletches. Like if you red Fletch, load a flip the withering shot for 10, it's just, and their reds block 1 less, it's just gross.
I think Red Fletcher Red Tail I actually really like in Riptide. The other ones I am a little bit lower on now, but the red one for sure, it just does too much damage. It's a 1 for 4 go
Yeah.
again. That could be a 1 for 5. It's like it's good.
Yeah. And I think the yellow is pretty mid. I've liked the blue in late games where you need to be able to have enough life to play it, but if you can Fletch, buff an arrow, make their blues block less when their deck is mostly blues, it's pretty good into fatigue.
Yeah, that is very true. That is very true. When you know your opponent's whole hand is like blue, yellow, you get to rip a yellow out of their hand. It feels pretty good. Oh, sorry. And one other thing, just correction. There's 2 arrows in the format that doesn't get buffed by aim counters. It's Amplifying Arrow at Mythic and Bard Undertow at Mythic, but Bard Undertow gets an on hit with an aim counter.
Yeah. So all that to say, aim counter is good, free reload good.
Amplifying Arrow
Try to do
bad.
that as much as you can. Yeah, Amplifying Arrow, pretty bad. It's a yellow block 3, though.
Yeah, I would pick it. It's $2 or $1. I don't know. It's more than $1.
Fair enough. Okay. I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about with Ranger. Is there anything else that you have left?
Yeah, just a quick mention about the mythic quivers. Sorry, it's a mythic quiver and a legendary quiver. So let's first talk about the mythic one. It's Quiver of Rustling Leaves. My personal take, I don't think this card is good. What do you think about this one? In Outsiders Limited.
I have no idea. I haven't really thought about it. In Azalea, I'd rather have Crow's Nest for sure. I think it's just the aim counter is pretty real. In Riptide, yeah, I have trouble imagining myself wanting to do this. And the Riptide Quiver is kind of, it's not a good card, but it's kind of useful because sometimes you have a defense reaction in your arsenal, and you need to be able to get it out of there. So I think that might just be better than this card in limited.
Yeah, I think so too. And then the other quiver to talk about would be Quiver of Abyssal Depths. This is the legendary quiver. It just says pay 3 as an instant and destroy it. You can shuffle 3 arrows with different names from your graveyard to your deck. I think this card is actually very, very good in Riptide. I do not know if it's playable in Azalea.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's something that matters. And I think that Crow's Nest is really, really good in Azalea. Because much like how we said getting the 1 damage from flipping with Barb Castaway is good. Well, you can do that in Azalea. The getting the 1 damage on your arrows coming off the top with Dominate is also very, very strong. So
Yeah, and very very basic for Riptide. You get 3 more cards in your deck, and if you wanted 37 cards, you're okay with 40 cards. And having the Quiver Abyssal Depths basically just means you get to block a little bit more aggressively, and then just get 3 more red arrows back in the deck late game. So card's good.
anything else?
Nope. I think that's everything about Ranger. Yeah, I think that's all I want to talk about.
All right. Thanks for listening. Hope that this episode helped you learn a little more about Ranger, both Rangers, how to get into them and how to draft them. Let us know in the comments down below if you have any thoughts about Ranger, maybe cards that you like that we didn't mention, or ways that you've been getting into the deck that we haven't touched on. Would love to hear about that in the comments down below. Similarly, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you in the comments section or on Twitter. You can find Jay at UedaJ, and you can find me at Yukili Bender on Twitter, or you can email us directly at onthebauble@gmail.com. Yeah, that's going to be it for tonight. Good luck drafting Outsiders, and hope you find some sweet Ranger decks out there. Did you have something, or?
No,
Oh,
not
I
really.
guess I have something really short I can say. So lately I've been recording some of the drafts that I've been doing. Just bought like a clamp that I've been clamping onto the back of the chairs so I can record the drafts, and I have quite a few drafts at this point. Some of them are pretty interesting. I do plan on uploading them onto the channel, maybe with some commentary, or maybe at this point just uploading them at some point. But anyways, keep an eye out for that. It will be coming soon-ish. I was hoping to get something up before Pro Tour, but realistically, it might be just after Pro Tour at this point. But yeah, certainly in the next couple of weeks here, you can expect to see some kind of draft walkthrough style content. And I think we could probably even, once we've covered all the classes, touch on some of those drafts or some drafts that you've done, and just kind of talk about pick by pick what cards we're picking, what cards you could have picked, and just sort of some of the key points in the draft. Because I think that there's a lot of really interesting decision points about how you navigate the draft, how you stay open, or how you lean into certain classes. And I think that there's a lot to unpack there, especially compared to like Uprising, where I think that this mattered, but was pretty condensed. Like you have a couple picks to do this, and for the most part, you're kind of forcing. Whereas I think in this draft, there's like a lot of nuance to it, and staying open is pretty valuable.
Yeah, that'll be good. That'll be good to talk about. And honestly, it'll be interesting to watch some of your drafts and take an actual look at which cards you're picking over which cards.
Yeah, you can. We'll go over it, and you can tell me how bad I am for picking all the lousy ranger cards that I'm picking.
I doubt that's the case. You always draft so safe. So like every time I look at your drafts, I'm just like, oh, you didn't want to move into this, and your explanation is gonna be like, yeah, because I didn't know if it was open or not.
Yeah, I want to draft the open lane. I think it's really good in this set. I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
think so.
really, really good in this set.
I think because all the heroes are pretty balanced, it's like when you find the open lane and get into it, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, then let's wrap it up for today.
Bye, everyone.
Right, good night.